Every marriage in the Spanish royal family has always been more than a wedding. It has been a referendum on what kind of monarchy Spain actually wants to be. And when Princess Leonor eventually marries, whoever she chooses and whenever she chooses him, that marriage will become the next chapter in a story that has been quietly rewriting the rules of the Spanish crown for 2 decades. To understand why her marriage matters so much, we have to go back and trace exactly how far this institution has already traveled, because the distance is far greater than most people realize. Start with the moment that actually broke the mold, because it happened 1 generation before Leonor was even born. In November 2003, King Juan Carlos and the Spanish public learned that Prince Felipe, heir to the throne, intended to marry Letizia Ortiz Roquesolano, a television journalist from Asturias. She was not an aristocrat. She was not from a noble family with centuries of pedigree behind her name. Her father was a journalist and her mother a nurse. She had already been married once before, in a civil ceremony to a literature teacher, a marriage that ended in divorce after less than a year. By the standards that had governed royal marriages across Europe for centuries, standards that had shaped Felipe's own parents' arranged union, Letizia should have been an impossible match for the future King of Spain. She wasn't, and the reason she wasn't tells you almost everything about how the Spanish monarchy had already begun quietly transforming itself. Because her first marriage had been civil rather than religious, the Catholic Church did not recognize it as valid, which meant no annulment was required before she could marry Felipe in the church. That technicality mattered enormously, because it meant Juan Carlos, a king whose own marriage to Sophia of Greece had been arranged through the old aristocratic channels of European royalty, could give his blessing to his son marrying a commoner and a divorcee without triggering a full theological crisis. The wedding took place in May 2004 at the Almudena Cathedral, the first royal wedding held there in nearly a century, and Spain watched a journalist become its future queen. That wedding wasn't just a personal love story, even though it was framed as one at the time. It was the moment the Spanish crown quietly signaled that it intended to survive the 21st century by bending rather than breaking. A monarchy restored only in 1975, after decades of dictatorship under Franco, could not afford to look like a fossil clinging to rules about blood and rank that the rest of Spanish society had long since abandoned. Letizia's marriage to Felipe was the institution's first real proof that it understood this. It told the country that the crown was willing to let a commoner, an accomplished, working, independently opinionated woman with her own career and her own past, stand beside the future king, not as a footnote but as an equal partner in the modern monarchy's public identity. Now layer onto that the second major fault line running through this story, one that is far from resolved and directly touches Leonor herself, the question of gender. Spain's constitution, ratified in 1978, established what's called male preference cognatic primogeniture in Article 57. In plain terms, that means daughters can inherit the throne, but only if there is no son ahead of them, regardless of birth order. A younger brother, under this system, jumps ahead of an older sister in the line of succession. When Leonor was born in 2005, the very same year, this became a live political question, because at that moment nobody knew whether Felipe and Letizia would go on to have a son who would leapfrog her. The socialist government at the time, with the backing of the main opposition party as well, actually proposed amending the constitution to absolute primogeniture, meaning the eldest child inherits regardless of sex, matching reforms already made in Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and Luxembourg. It looked, briefly, like Spain was about to join that wave of modernization. Then, in 2006, Letizia gave birth to a second daughter, Sophia, not a son, and the political urgency evaporated overnight. Without a male heir on the horizon threatening to displace Leonor, the pressure to amend the constitution simply disappeared. To this day, Article 57 has never been changed. Leonor remains heir not because Spanish law formally recognizes equal primogeniture, but because biology never forced the country to confront its own rule. She is, technically, still just one hypothetical baby brother away from having been constitutionally bypassed, a strange and rarely discussed fact given how comfortably the public now refers to her as Spain's future queen. This is the quiet, unfinished business sitting underneath every conversation about Leonor's future, including her marriage, because succession law and marriage law in Spain are stitched together in the same article of the Constitution. Article 57.4 states that anyone in the line of succession who marries against the express prohibition of the king and the Cortes Generales, the Spanish Parliament, is excluded from succession, along with their descendants. That single clause means Leonor's marriage isn't just a personal milestone. It is, structurally, one of the few remaining levers the Spanish state has to intervene directly in the private life of its future monarch. In theory, if Leonor wanted to marry someone the king and the Cortes formally opposed, she could be constitutionally erased from the succession entirely, along with any children she has. No monarchy that has fully modernized its marriage rules retains a clause with teeth quite that sharp. And this is where the evolution of the crown becomes genuinely interesting to watch in real time, because Leonor's marriage will be the first true test of whether that old constitutional muscle still has any strength left in it, or whether, like the male preference succession rule, it has simply become a dormant clause nobody expects to actually use. When her father married a divorced commoner in 2004, it was already clear the institution had softened dramatically since Juan Carlos's own generation. When Leonor marries, the question becomes whether that softening continues, accelerates, or quietly reverses. Consider what acceptable has already come to mean for a royal spouse in Spain, and how radically that definition has shifted in just 2 generations. Juan Carlos married Sofia of Greece, a fellow royal, in a match that carried the weight of old dynastic diplomacy, 2 crowned houses joining together in the traditional European way. Felipe married a Spanish-born journalist with no royal blood, no aristocratic title, and a previous marriage behind her, and the country ultimately embraced her, however rocky the beginning. If that trajectory continues in a straight line, Leonor's future husband could plausibly be almost anyone: a foreign national, someone from a completely different faith tradition, someone with no connection to Spanish high society whatsoever, someone who works an ordinary job. Each of those possibilities would have been nearly unthinkable for a Spanish heir apparent 100 years ago and now barely raises an eyebrow in a country whose last 2 consorts were, by 19th-century standards, deeply irregular choices. But there's a countervailing pressure worth naming honestly, because it complicates the tidy narrative of ever forward progress. Leonor is not in the same structural position her father was. Felipe married as a male heir whose position in the succession was never in question, backed by an unbroken assumption that the crown would pass to him regardless of who he married, so long as the marriage wasn't formally vetoed. Leonor's position, as we've just discussed, exists on a foundation that has never been fully secured by constitutional reform. She is Spain's heir presumptive, not heir apparent, a technical distinction that exists precisely because her position could still theoretically be undone. That subtle instability may make the institution more cautious, not less, about how her marriage unfolds. A modernizing gesture that felt safe for Felipe, whose claim to the throne was never in doubt, might feel riskier for Leonor, whose claim still rests on a rule Spain never got around to fixing. This is also where we can look outward, briefly, to the rest of Europe, because Spain is not modernizing in isolation. The monarchies that adopted equal primogeniture, Sweden in 1980, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and Luxembourg each in their own turn, and the United Kingdom in 2013 with the Succession to the Crown Act, did so specifically because they judged that a monarchy which still formally privileged sons over daughters looked increasingly indefensible to a public that had otherwise embraced gender equality as a basic constitutional value. Spain drafted similar legislation back in 2004 and then simply let it die once the political pressure eased. That makes Spain something of an outlier among its peer monarchies, a country that flirted with full modernization and then quietly stepped back from it. Leonor's marriage, and eventually her reign, will unfold under a constitution that Spain never finished updating, a strange kind of unfinished business that no other reigning heir presumptive in Western Europe currently carries in quite the same way. So what does all of this actually tell us about where the crown is heading? It tells us that the Spanish monarchy has proven, twice now within living memory, that it can absorb enormous changes to what a royal spouse looks like, first with Sofia's conversion from Greek Orthodoxy to Catholicism to enable her marriage to Juan Carlos, then far more dramatically with Letitia's arrival as a divorced, commoner, working journalist who became queen consort. Each time, the institution found a way to bend its traditions just enough to keep pace with a changing country, while still holding on to the ceremonial core: the Catholic wedding, the constitutional consent process, the public performance of continuity that makes the monarchy recognizably itself. Leonor's marriage will very likely follow that same pattern: real modernization in who she's permitted to marry, wrapped around a constitutional shell. Article 57. Four's veto power and the male preference succession clause among them, that Spain has proven remarkably reluctant to actually rewrite even when it clearly could. That reluctance isn't necessarily a failure of nerve. It may simply reflect something true about how constitutional monarchies survive at all. They change enormously in practice, in who marries whom and how those marriages are received by the public, while changing as little as possible on paper, because touching the actual constitutional text always risks reopening questions about whether the monarchy should exist in its current form at all. Spain's political class discovered that lesson directly in 2004, when a reform meant to modernize succession law quietly died the moment the immediate political urgency behind it disappeared. Nobody wanted to reopen that fight without a clear practical reason to. Which brings us to the real stakes of Leonor's eventual marriage, the ones that go beyond any individual man she might choose. Her wedding will be watched not just as a personal milestone or a piece of royal spectacle, but as a live data point in an ongoing, decades-long experiment about how much a 900-year-old institution can bend before it either breaks or becomes something genuinely new. Her grandmother converted religions to make a royal marriage possible. Her mother broke centuries of aristocratic marriage tradition simply by being herself, an ordinary, accomplished Spanish woman who happened to fall in love with a prince. Leonor inherits both of those precedents, and whatever she does next, whoever she chooses and however that choice is received, will become the newest chapter in the same unfinished story: a monarchy in Spain that keeps insisting it is ancient, while quietly, marriage by marriage, becoming something its own constitution has never quite caught up to describing.